Hi, I am Miles Porter, and if you are awake right now, that is all right. That is just fine. You have found a good place to rest, and I am glad you are here. Tonight I thought we might take a journey together. Not a fast journey, not a journey with any particular urgency, just a slow, gentle drift through time and iron and steam. Through the story of how Britain built its railways during the reign of Queen Victoria. And if at any point your eyelids grow heavy, if your breathing begins to slow, that is exactly what is supposed to happen. That is the whole idea. Let us settle in together, you and me. Imagine we are aboard a sleeper train somewhere in the English countryside. The year does not matter precisely. What matters is the gentle sway of the carriage beneath us, the soft amber glow of the lamp in our compartment, the rhythmic sound of wheels turning over iron rails. That sound, that steady, patient, unhurried sound. It has been putting travelers to sleep for nearly 200 years now. The window beside us is dark, except for the occasional passing light from some distant farmhouse. Rain is falling softly against the glass, and the sound mingles with the wheels beneath us. We are wrapped in wool blankets, and the leather seat has grown warm where we have been sitting. There is nowhere we need to be, nothing we need to do. Just this. Just the train moving through the night. Take a moment to feel the rhythm of the train. Feel how it sways gently from side to side. Feel how the wheels pass over the joints in the rails with a steady, predictable pattern. Click and clack, click and clack. It is a patient sound, an unhurried sound, a sound that has carried millions of people safely through the darkness, night after night, for generation after generation. The air in our compartment smells faintly of coal smoke and polished wood and the wool of our blankets. It is a comfortable smell, a familiar smell, a smell that speaks of journeys and arrivals, of departures and homecomings, of all the countless travelers who have sat in compartments like this one, watching the world slide past the window, feeling the weight of the day lift slowly from their shoulders. And as we settle deeper into this moment, I thought I might tell you how all of this began, how this idea of riding through the darkness on iron rails came to be. It is a gentle story in its way, a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, one small step at a time. A story of coal and steam and iron, a story of patience and persistence, a story of how the world changed, slowly at first, and then all at once. Long before Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, long before the first public railways carried passengers, there were coal mines in the north of England. And in those mines, men needed ways to move heavy loads of coal from deep underground to the surface, and then onward to the rivers and canals where boats would carry it away. They used horses at first, patient, strong horses that pulled wagons along muddy roads. But the roads were difficult, especially in winter, and the horses could only pull so much. Someone had the idea to lay wooden rails. The wheels of the wagons would run along these rails, smooth and steady, guided and true. The horses could pull heavier loads on the rails than they could on the road. This was progress. Small progress, perhaps, but progress all the same. Then the wooden rails wore out, and someone replaced them with iron. Iron was stronger. Iron lasted longer. Iron could bear more weight. And so the wagonways spread across the mining regions of northern England, carrying coal from the pits to the rivers, one wagon at a time. This is where it started, with coal and horses and iron rails, with the simple need to move heavy things from one place to another, with practical men solving practical problems, one at a time. There was a village in Northumberland called Wylam, about 9 miles west of Newcastle upon Tyne. It was a small place, unremarkable to most eyes, known mainly for its colliery. Coal was everything in these parts. Coal was work, and work was life. The village consisted mainly of laborers' cottages, an unsightly pumping engine surrounded by heaps of ash and coal dust, and the wagonway that carried coal to the River Tyne. And in that village, in a common 2-storied, red-tiled cottage divided into 4 laborers' compartments, on the 9th of June in 1781, a boy was born into a family of coal workers. His name was George Stephenson. He was the second child of Robert and Mabel Stephenson. George's father, Robert, worked as a fireman at the Wylam Colliery pumping engine. His job was to tend the fire that heated the water that made the steam that powered the engine that pumped water out of the mine. It was important work, but it paid very low wages, barely enough to feed his family of 6 children. There was no money for schooling. George could not read or write. Neither could his father. Neither could his mother. None of the family could. This was not unusual. This was simply life for working people in that time and place. Education was a luxury that families like the Stephensons could not afford. George spent his childhood as poor children did in those days. He herded cows. He drove the gin horse at the colliery, the animal that turned the winding gear. He picked stones from the coal. He helped his father tend the engine. By the time he was 14, he was working as an assistant fireman. By 17, he was an engineman at Water Row Pit in Newburn. But George was different from many of his fellow workers. He was fascinated by machines. He would take them apart in his mind, try to understand how they worked, why they worked. He watched the steam engines that pumped water from the mines. He watched the wheels turn and the pistons rise and fall. He asked questions. He paid attention. And when he was 18 years old, George Stephenson made a decision that would change his life. He paid for himself to attend night school. After working all day in the colliery, he would walk to the schoolroom and learn to read and write, to work with numbers, to understand the principles that made machines work. This was not easy. This required tremendous determination. This required a belief that knowledge mattered, that understanding the world was worth the effort. He mended clocks and fixed shoes to earn extra money. He was practical in every way, always looking for ways to improve his situation, to learn new skills, to solve new problems. This is the sort of man he was. Patient, determined, curious, never satisfied with simply accepting the world as it was given to him. In 1802, George married Frances Henderson, the daughter of a poor farmer. They lived in one room of a cottage, and George worked as a brakesman, controlling the winding gear at the pit. Their son, Robert, was born in 1803. George poured everything he knew into the boy, determined that Robert would have the education that he himself had missed. He sent Robert to school, paid for books, taught him about engines and mechanics in the evenings. But life was hard. Francis became ill with consumption. George was offered a job operating a steam engine in Scotland, but before he could leave, Frances died. She had been sick for a long time. George was left with a young son to raise and no wife to help him. This was 1806. For a time, George's sister looked after young Robert while George worked. Then George went to Scotland for a year, working at a colliery there, leaving Robert with relatives. When he returned, he brought his son back to live with him, and they were rarely separated after that. Robert would grow up watching his father work, learning from him, eventually surpassing him in formal education while inheriting all of his practical skills. George had been watching the attempts of other men to build locomotives, steam engines that could move themselves along rails, pulling heavy loads behind them. The idea had been in the air for years. Steam engines had been pumping water out of mines since the early 1700s. The question was whether you could make one small enough and powerful enough to move itself. There was a Cornishman named Richard Trevithick who had built the very first railway locomotive. Trevithick was a big man, strong and inventive, the son of a mine captain. He had grown up around steam engines, watching them pump water from the deep tin and copper mines of Cornwall. He had experimented with high-pressure steam, which was considered dangerous by many at the time, but which produced much more power than the low-pressure engines that were then in common use. On the 21st of February, 1804, at the Penydarren Ironworks in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, Trevithick demonstrated his locomotive. The ironmaster, Samuel Homfray, had bet 500 guineas with a rival ironmaster that Trevithick's engine could haul 10 tons of iron along the tramway from Penydarren to the canal at Abercynon, a distance of about 9 3/4 miles. The locomotive had a single cylinder, an 8-foot flywheel, and a long piston rod. It was built from an existing stationary engine that Trevithick had modified for the purpose. On that February day, it hauled 10 tons of iron, 5 wagons, and 70 men along the tramway. The journey took 4 hours and 5 minutes, an average speed of roughly 2.5 miles per hour. Slow, yes, but it proved that the idea could work. Trevithick wrote about the journey afterward. He said they had proceeded with the engine, carrying the iron and the passengers the whole of the journey. He said it had worked very well, and it had. The demonstration was a success, but there was a problem. The locomotive was too heavy for the rails of that era. The cast iron plates kept breaking under its weight. The engine made only 3 journeys before the tramway was so damaged that it could not continue. The locomotive was eventually converted into a stationary engine, used to power a hammer at the ironworks. The idea was ahead of its time. The infrastructure was not ready for it. Trevithick built other locomotives after that. He built one at Wylam, near where George Stephenson was born, but it too proved too heavy for the wooden wagonway there. In 1808, he built Catch Me Who Can and set it up on a circular track in London, charging people a shilling to ride around in a carriage behind it. But the track kept breaking, and the venture was not commercially successful. Richard Trevithick would spend his later years pursuing other projects, including mining ventures in Peru and explorations in Costa Rica. He returned to England penniless and died in poverty in 1833 at the age of 62. He was buried in an unmarked grave. He never saw how far his invention would go. He never knew that he would one day be called the true father of the railways. But the idea was planted, and men like George Stephenson were paying attention. Let me pause here for a moment. The train is still moving steadily through the night. The rhythm of the wheels is unchanging. Outside our window, the darkness is complete, except for the faint glow of starlight through the clouds. We are safe and warm in our compartment, and there is nothing we need to do but rest. If your body is holding any tension, you might let it soften now, perhaps in your shoulders, perhaps in your jaw, perhaps in your hands. Just let it go. The train will carry us. The train knows where we are going. All we have to do is rest. In the years after Trevithick's demonstration, other engineers tried to build locomotives. At Wylam Colliery, the owner Christopher Blackett and his engineer William Headley built several engines in the early 1810s. They experimented with different designs, trying to solve the problems that had defeated Trevithick. One of their locomotives, called Puffing Billy, would run for decades and is still preserved today in the Science Museum in London. George Stephenson watched these experiments with great interest. By this time, he was working at Killingworth Colliery, north of Newcastle, where he had been appointed engine wright in 1812. His job was to maintain all the engines at the colliery, to repair them when they broke down, to improve them when he could. He was 31 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life working with steam engines. In 1814, George persuaded the colliery owners to let him build a locomotive of his own. He called it Blücher, after the Prussian general who had helped defeat Napoleon. It was his first attempt, and it was not perfect. But it could pull 30 tons up a hill at 4 miles per hour. Not fast, but steady, reliable, a beginning. George continued to improve his designs. He filed patents for improved wheels, for improved springs, for improved methods of coupling the wheels together. He learned from each failure, refined each success. He developed a safety lamp for miners, which he tested by personally carrying it into a particularly dangerous section of a mine filled with explosive gas. The lamp worked. George Stephenson emerged safely. Some credit for the lamp was disputed with Sir Humphrey Davy, who had developed a similar design at about the same time. But the miners of the North knew who had risked his life to test it. And then, in 1821, something remarkable happened. George Stephenson was appointed as the engineer for a new railway being planned between the town of Stockton and the town of Darlington in County Durham. It would be the first public railway to use steam locomotives, the first railway designed to carry passengers as well as freight, the first step toward a new world. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened on the 27th of September, 1825. It was a momentous day, though few who were there could have understood just how momentous. George Stephenson himself drove the locomotive that day. It was called Locomotion Number 1. It had a tall chimney and a vertical boiler, and a design that looked primitive even by the standards of a few years later. But it worked. The train carried coal and flour and passengers, about 600 people altogether. Some rode in a purpose-built passenger coach, others sat on wagons or clung to whatever space they could find. The train traveled at speeds up to 15 miles per hour. People lined the route to watch. They had never seen anything like it. A machine that moved under its own power, pulling wagons behind it, faster than a horse could run. The future had arrived. The Stockton and Darlington Railway was primarily designed to carry coal, and it did that very well. Horses were still used for some of the lighter trains, and the passenger service was not particularly comfortable. But it proved that railways worked. It proved that steam locomotives could be practical. It proved that people would pay to travel by rail. And that proof was enough to inspire something much grander. The city of Liverpool was one of the great ports of Britain, handling vast quantities of cotton and other goods. The city of Manchester was the center of the textile industry, with hundreds of mills turning raw cotton into fabric. The two cities were separated by about 35 miles of difficult terrain, and the existing transportation options were inadequate. The roads were slow. The canal was often congested and expensive. Something better was needed. A group of merchants and businessmen began to plan a railway between Liverpool and Manchester. It would be the first modern intercity railway, designed from the start to carry both passengers and freight at speeds that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. They hired George Stephenson as their chief engineer, and his son Robert, now a young man of considerable talent himself, worked closely beside him. The construction of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was a tremendous undertaking. The line had to cross difficult terrain, including a peat bog called Chat Moss, that many engineers believed could not be crossed at all. George Stephenson proved them wrong. He floated the railway across the bog on a bed of hurdles and branches and heather, creating a stable foundation where none should have been possible. It was ingenious. It was practical. It was exactly the sort of solution that George Stephenson was known for. The line included tunnels and cuttings and bridges and viaducts. It was built to the highest standards of the day, with gentle gradients and smooth curves that would allow trains to travel at unprecedented speeds. Stephenson surveyed the route himself, walking the entire distance multiple times, making careful measurements, planning every detail. The directors of the railway were uncertain about how best to power their trains. Some wanted to use stationary steam engines positioned at intervals along the line, with cables to pull the trains from one station to the next. This was a proven technology, used in some collieries, and it seemed safer than relying on locomotives alone. Others, including George Stephenson, argued for locomotives. He believed they were the future. He believed they were more flexible, more efficient, more capable of meeting the demands of a busy railway. And so, to settle the matter, the directors announced a competition. They offered a prize of £500 to the builder of the best locomotive, with strict conditions that any entry would need to meet. The locomotive would have to pull 3 times its own weight at a speed of at least 10 miles per hour. It would have to run reliably for the equivalent of a round trip between Liverpool and Manchester. It would have to prove that steam locomotives could be trusted. They called it the Rainhill Trials. The trials were held in October of 1829 along a stretch of track at Rainhill in Lancashire. The level section of track was about 1.5 miles long, perfect for testing locomotives at speed. The dates were set for the 6th through the 14th of October. Thousands of people came to watch. They had read about the competition in the newspapers. They had heard rumors about the machines that would be tested. They wanted to see the future with their own eyes. 10 locomotives were entered, but only 5 were actually ready to compete when the trials began on the 6th of October. The others had not been completed in time, or their builders had withdrawn. There was Cyclopede, built by Thomas Shaw Brandreth. It was not really a locomotive at all. It was a platform powered by a horse walking on a treadmill. The horse was named Dobbins. The machine was withdrawn on the first day, after it became clear it could not meet the requirements. There was Perseverance, built by Timothy Burstall of Edinburgh. It had been damaged during transport to Rainhill and spent most of the trials being repaired. When it finally ran on the last day, it could only reach 6 miles per hour, well below the minimum required. Burstall was given a consolation prize of £25 for his efforts. There was Sans Pareil, built by Timothy Hackworth. Hackworth was a skilled engineer who had worked with George Stephenson in the past. He was responsible for maintaining the locomotives on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. His engine was well built and powerful, but it suffered from mechanical problems during the trials. A cylinder cracked, possibly because of a casting flaw. Sans Pareil completed some of its runs, but could not finish the full course reliably. There was Novelty, built by John Ericsson and John Braithwaite in London. It was a beautiful machine, light and elegant, unlike anything the crowds had seen before. It was the world's first tank locomotive, carrying its own water supply rather than pulling a separate tender. It was fast, reaching speeds of nearly 30 miles per hour in demonstration runs. The crowds loved it. But Novelty had been built in a hurry, and it suffered from problems with its boiler. Joints failed, pipes burst. It could not complete the required distance reliably. Ericsson and Braithwaite asked for more time to make repairs, but the judges could not wait indefinitely. And then there was Rocket. Rocket was designed by Robert Stephenson, George's son. He was just 26 years old, but he had been working with locomotives since childhood. He had formal engineering training that his father had never had. He understood the science behind the machines, as well as the practical details of building them. And he had been thinking hard about what it would take to win this competition. The locomotives that existed at the time were slow and inefficient. They wasted heat. They could not produce steam fast enough to maintain high speeds. Robert Stephenson set out to solve these problems. First, there was the boiler. Most locomotives of that era had a single large tube running through the water, carrying hot gases from the firebox to the chimney. The heat transferred slowly through the walls of the tube. Robert, working with Henry Booth, the secretary of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, designed a multi-tube boiler instead. Instead of one large tube, Rocket had 25 copper tubes, each about 3 inches in diameter, running through the water. This greatly increased the surface area through which heat could transfer. The water boiled faster. The engine produced more steam. Second, there was the blast pipe. When steam exhausted from the cylinders, it had to go somewhere. Robert directed it up through the chimney. This created a powerful draft that pulled air through the firebox, making the fire burn hotter. The harder the engine worked, the stronger the draft, the hotter the fire, the more steam it produced. It was a self-reinforcing system. It was brilliant. Third, there were the cylinders. On earlier locomotives, the cylinders were usually vertical, mounted on top of the boiler. Robert mounted rocket cylinders at an angle, about 35 degrees from horizontal, and connected them directly to the driving wheels. This was more efficient, transmitting more power to the wheels with less waste. Rocket was built at the 4th Street Works in Newcastle, Robert Stephenson's company. It was painted yellow with a white chimney. It weighed about 4¼ tons. On the 20th of September, it was taken apart and transported to Liverpool by horse wagon and steamer, arriving at Rainhill on the 18th of September for reassembly. The trials tested each locomotive under controlled conditions. They had to run back and forth along the level stretch of track, covering the equivalent of a return journey between Liverpool and Manchester, about 70 miles in total. They had to maintain a speed of at least 10 miles per hour while pulling 3 times their own weight. They had to stop to refuel and take on water, just as they would in regular service. Rocket passed every test. It averaged about 12 miles per hour while hauling 13 tons. It reached speeds of nearly 30 miles per hour when running light. It was reliable. It did not break down. It completed every run it was asked to complete. The other locomotives, one by one, failed or withdrew. On the 8th of October, the judges declared Rocket the winner. George Stephenson, Robert Stephenson, and Henry Booth shared the 500-pound prize. More importantly, they won the contract to build locomotives for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The future of steam traction was assured. The Times newspaper carried detailed reports of the trials. People across Britain read about what had happened at Rainhill. They read about the speed, the reliability, the power of these new machines. They began to understand that the world was changing. I am going to pause here for a while, just to let you rest. The train is still carrying us through the night. The rhythm of the wheels has not changed. We are safe and warm, and there is nothing we need to do. Feel the gentle sway of the carriage. Feel how your body moves with it, naturally, without effort. This is how it has always been on trains. This gentle rocking, this steady motion. Generation after generation of travelers have fallen asleep to this rhythm. You are part of a long tradition now. Outside the window, the darkness is complete. We might be anywhere. We might be traveling through any era. The train does not care about time. The train only knows its purpose, to carry us safely from one place to another through the quiet hours of the night. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift. The story will be here when you return. There is no hurry. There is never any hurry on a night train. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened on the 15th of September, 1830. It was meant to be a day of triumph. The greatest men in Britain were there to celebrate. The Prime Minister, the Duke of Wellington, had come from London. Members of Parliament, peers of the realm, prominent businessmen and dignitaries filled the special carriages that had been prepared for the occasion. 8 decorated locomotives were ready for the procession. They would travel together from Liverpool to Manchester, demonstrating to the world what the railway could do. Bands were playing. Crowds lined the route for miles, eager to witness history. George Stephenson himself drove one of the locomotives that day, the Northumbrian, pulling the Duke of Wellington's special carriage. Robert Stephenson drove another, the Rocket. The Victor of Rainhill was in the procession as well, driven by Joseph Locke, one of George's assistants, who would later become a famous engineer in his own right. The train left Liverpool in the morning, 8 locomotives moving in procession along both tracks of the railway. The carriages were magnificent, decorated with flags and bunting, filled with the most important people in the country. The crowds cheered as the train passed. Children waved. Factory workers paused to watch. It seemed like the beginning of something wonderful. But the day would be remembered for tragedy as well as triumph. At Parkside Station, about halfway along the line, the train stopped to take on water and fuel. This was necessary because the locomotives could only carry so much water in their tenders. The stop had been planned. What had not been planned was that many of the passengers would choose to get off and stretch their legs. Despite warnings from the railway officials, dozens of dignitaries climbed down from their carriages and began walking along the track. They wanted to greet acquaintances in other carriages. They wanted to admire the locomotives. They wanted to see and be seen on this historic day. Among those who alighted was William Huskisson, the Member of Parliament for Liverpool. He was 60 years old, a prominent politician who had served in the cabinet. He had been a strong supporter of the railway, one of the people who had made its construction possible. But he had also fallen out politically with the Duke of Wellington, and the two men had not spoken in some time. Huskisson had been suffering from health problems. He had recently had surgery for a kidney condition, and his doctor had advised him to skip the railway opening. But Huskisson believed the event was too important to miss. He came anyway. When the train stopped at Parkside, Huskisson saw an opportunity. He walked over to the Duke of Wellington's carriage, hoping to shake hands, hoping perhaps to mend the rift between them. The Duke received him cordially. They were in the midst of shaking hands when someone shouted a warning. Another locomotive was approaching on the adjacent track. It was Rocket, moving forward to take on water. People had not realized that the tracks were still in use. They had not expected any movement while the trains were stopped. Some of the men standing on the track pressed themselves against the Duke's carriage, where they were safe. The space between the carriage and the track was narrow, but it was enough. Others jumped clear, scrambling to get out of the way. But Huskisson, perhaps confused, perhaps slowed by his recent illness, perhaps simply unlucky, made a fatal mistake. He tried to climb into the Duke's carriage. The door swung open under his weight. He lost his balance and fell across the track. Rocket's wheels passed over his leg, crushing it terribly below the knee. Eyewitnesses described the injury as horrific. The bone was shattered. The blood loss was severe. George Stephenson acted immediately. He uncoupled his locomotive, Northumbrian, from the Duke's train and prepared to rush Huskisson to medical help. The injured man was placed on a door that had been torn from a railway building, then transferred to a small carriage that had been carrying a band. George Stephenson drove the engine himself, pushing it to speeds that seemed incredible at the time. perhaps 35 miles per hour, desperate to get Huskisson to help as quickly as possible. They reached Eccles, and Huskisson was carried to the vicarage of the Reverend Thomas Blackburn. Surgeons were called. A tourniquet was applied to slow the bleeding, but the injury was too severe. The surgeons discussed amputation, but feared that Huskisson was too weak to survive the shock of surgery. William Huskisson died that evening at about 9 o'clock. He was able to make his will before he died. He was conscious at the end, aware of what was happening. The vicar's wife, Emma Blackburn, helped care for him in his final hours, and Huskisson's widow later wrote to thank her for her kindness. Huskisson was not the first person to die in a railway accident. Workers had been killed during construction. There had been incidents on the Stockton and Darlington Railway and on the wagonways before that. But Huskisson's death was different. He was famous. He was prominent. He died on the most public day in railway history, in front of the Prime Minister and hundreds of witnesses, struck down by the most celebrated locomotive of the age. The newspapers reported his death across Britain and around the world. For many people, this was the first time they had really thought about railways. The publicity surrounding Huskisson's death did more to spread awareness of the new technology than any amount of positive coverage could have done. People realized that the railways were real, that they were powerful, that they would change everything. The railway opened anyway. It had to. There were crowds waiting in Manchester, tens of thousands of people who had gathered to see the trains arrive. The directors feared what might happen if the trains did not come, and so the procession continued, subdued and somber, arriving in Manchester hours late and to a mixed reception. But despite the tragedy, the railway was a success. Within weeks, regular passenger service had begun. Trains ran from Liverpool to Manchester and back multiple times a day, carrying thousands of people. The journey that had taken a full day by stagecoach could now be completed in less than 2 hours. Business travelers could go to meetings in another city and return home the same day. The possibilities seemed endless. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway proved that railways could work. It proved that people would pay to travel by rail. It proved that the future would be built on iron and steam. Other railways quickly followed. Investors lined up to fund new lines. Engineers competed to design faster, more powerful locomotives. The railway age had begun. Let me tell you about the train we are riding now, about the sounds and sensations of traveling by rail in the Victorian era, so that you can feel, as much as imagine, what it was like to be a passenger in those early days. The carriages of the early railways were divided by class. First-class passengers traveled in enclosed compartments, sometimes with padded seats and glass windows. Second class had seats but less comfort, perhaps open at the sides. Third class, in the early days, might be nothing more than open wagons exposed to the weather, with no seats at all. The compartments were small and intimate. A first-class compartment might hold 6 to 8 passengers seated on facing benches. There were oil lamps for light, though they were dim and smoky. There was no corridor connecting the compartments, so once you were inside, you could not leave until the train stopped. If you wanted to change seats or visit the lavatory, you had to wait for a station. The smell of coal smoke was constant. It came in through every crack and gap. It settled on your clothes and in your hair. Passengers who rode with the windows open arrived at their destinations covered in soot. But the windows had to be open in warm weather because there was no other ventilation. The sound of the train was overwhelming at first, the hissing of steam, the pounding of the engine, the clatter of wheels on rails. But after a while, these sounds became soothing. They became the rhythm of the journey. They became a kind of music that passengers learned to love. And the speed was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. 30 miles per hour seemed impossibly fast to people who had never traveled faster than a galloping horse. Some passengers became sick with motion. Others found it thrilling. But everyone agreed that it was something entirely new. The train we are riding now is more comfortable than those early carriages. We have a proper sleeping compartment with bunks and blankets and privacy. We have electric light and heating. We have corridors and lavatories and dining cars. But the essential experience is the same. The rhythm of the wheels, the sway of the carriage, the sensation of being carried through the night while the world sleeps. This is what the railways gave us. This experience, this way of traveling, this way of falling asleep while moving through space, trusting the machine and the men who run it to carry us safely to our destination. Now let me tell you about a tunnel, the Box Tunnel, on the Great Western Railway between Bath and Chippenham. It was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, one of the most remarkable engineers who ever lived, a man who built bridges and ships and railways that still stand today more than 150 years after his death. Brunel was born on the 9th of April, 1806, in Portsmouth. His father, Mark Isambard Brunel, was also a famous engineer, known for building the Thames Tunnel in London. Young Isambard was educated in France and England, trained in mathematics and engineering, and by the time he was 27, he had been appointed chief engineer of the Great Western Railway. The Great Western was one of the most ambitious railway projects of its time. It would connect London to Bristol, a distance of about 118 miles, passing through difficult terrain that included hills and valleys and the great obstacle of Box Hill. Brunel was determined to build the flattest, straightest railway he could. Most of the line would have gradients no steeper than 1 in 1,000, barely noticeable to the passengers. This required careful engineering. It required cuttings through hills and embankments, across valleys, and bridges over rivers, and it required a tunnel nearly 2 miles long, cutting straight through Box Hill. The Box Tunnel was the largest engineering work on the entire railway. At the time it was completed, in 1841, it was the longest railway tunnel in the world. Nearly 2 miles of darkness, driven through solid rock, deep beneath the earth. Building it was a formidable task. Brunel began by sinking vertical shafts along the line of the tunnel, so that crews could work on multiple sections at once. 6 permanent shafts were dug, ranging in depth from about 70 feet at the eastern end to nearly 300 feet toward the western end. The workers, equipment, materials, and excavated rock all had to go up and down these shafts, hoisted by steam-powered winches. The rock beneath Box Hill was a mixture of limestone and clay. The limestone, known locally as bath stone, was relatively easy to work. It had been quarried in the area since Roman times and was used to build many of the beautiful buildings in the nearby city of Bath. But the clay layers were more difficult. Water seeped through them constantly. The tunnels flooded. Pumps had to work around the clock to keep the workings dry. About 4,000 men worked on the tunnel at its peak. They used hand tools and explosives. A ton of gunpowder was consumed every week to blast through the rock. A ton of candles was burned every week just to provide light in the dark, cramped tunnels. The men worked in shifts around the clock, year after year. The work was dangerous beyond anything we might easily imagine today. Falls from the shafts, accidents with explosives, cave-ins when the rock proved less stable than expected, injuries from falling stones and runaway wagons. About 100 men died during the construction. Their names are mostly lost to history. We know only that they gave their lives to build this thing that we still use today. Work began in September 1836 and continued for nearly 5 years. By the summer of 1840, progress was slow. Less than half the tunnel had been completed. The clay sections were proving more difficult than expected. Water kept flooding the workings. The contractors were falling behind schedule. In January 1841, Brunel made a decision. He would increase the workforce from about 1,200 men to 4,000. He would finish the tunnel by force of numbers if necessary. He would not let this obstacle defeat him. The tunnel was completed in April 1841. When the two ends finally met beneath the hill, after years of work by different crews digging toward each other through the darkness, the alignment was off by less than 2 inches. This was an extraordinary achievement. The surveyors had done their work with precision that seems almost miraculous, given the tools available at the time. Brunel was so pleased that he reportedly removed a ring from his finger and gave it to the works foreman as a token of gratitude. The tunnel opened on the 30th of June, 1841, without much ceremony. The first train passed through from London to Bristol, completing a journey that would have taken days by stagecoach in just about 4 hours. The average speed was around 28 miles per hour. People could now travel from the capital to the West Country in a single morning. The world had changed. There is a legend about Box Tunnel that you may have heard. It is said that Brunel aligned the tunnel so that the rising sun would shine through its entire length on his birthday, the 9th of April. It is a romantic idea, the engineer building a monument to himself, hidden in the alignment of a tunnel. Recent research suggests this is not quite accurate. The sun does shine through the tunnel on certain days in April and in September, when its angle is just right, but it does not happen precisely on the 9th of April. The calculations do not quite work out. Still, it is a pleasant thought, and there is something fitting about the idea of sunlight passing through nearly 2 miles of darkness, illuminating for a moment what human hands and human will had made. Let us rest here again. Let the train carry us through another quiet stretch of night. The tunnel is behind us now. We have passed through the darkness and emerged into the starlit countryside. Feel your body relaxing. Feel the gentle motion of the carriage. Feel the warmth of the blankets around you. There is nothing to do but rest. Nothing to think about but the steady rhythm of the wheels beneath us. The Victorians built so many railways, so many lines and branches and connections. By 1850, about 6,000 miles of track connected all the major cities of Britain. By 1870, that number had grown to more than 15,000 miles. You could travel from one end of the country to the other in a single day. You could reach villages that had been isolated for centuries. The 1840s were a time of tremendous excitement about railways. People called it Railway Mania. The economy was improving after a difficult period. Interest rates were low. Existing railway companies were paying handsome dividends to their investors, sometimes 8 or 10% annually. Everyone wanted to get in on the action. Speculators formed new railway companies almost overnight. They advertised in newspapers, promising fantastic returns. They recruited prominent citizens to serve on their boards, lending an air of respectability to ventures that might be sound or might be fantasy. Anyone could form a company, gather investments, and submit a bill to Parliament asking for permission to build their line. In 1846, Parliament passed 263 acts authorizing new railway companies. The proposed routes totaled about 9,500 miles. People invested their life savings. Farmers mortgaged their land. Widows spent their children's inheritances. Clergymen, doctors, lawyers, shopkeepers, everyone wanted railway shares. Everyone believed the railways would make them rich. About a third of those railways were never built. Some companies collapsed because of poor planning. They had underestimated the costs of construction or overestimated the traffic their lines would carry. Others were bought out by larger competitors before they could lay a single mile of track. Some turned out to be fraudulent schemes from the start, designed to separate investors from their money and nothing more. When the bubble burst in the late 1840s, many families were ruined. The shares they had bought at high prices became worthless. The dividends they had been promised never came. Some people lost everything. There were bankruptcies and foreclosures, and, in some sad cases, suicides. One of the most prominent figures of this era was George Hudson, known as the Railway King. He was from Yorkshire, born in 1800 in the village of Howsham. He had started out as an apprentice to a draper in York, and eventually married his employer's daughter. He was ambitious, shrewd, and utterly ruthless in business. In 1827, Hudson inherited about £30,000 from a distant great-uncle. This was an enormous sum, perhaps equivalent to several million pounds today. Instead of living comfortably on this fortune, Hudson invested it in railways. He met George Stephenson and convinced him to route railways through York, making the city a major junction. He bought shares in railway companies. He joined their boards. He merged smaller companies into larger ones. He built an empire. By 1844, Hudson's companies controlled more than 1,000 miles of track. By 1849, at his peak, he controlled nearly 1,500 miles out of the country's total of about 5,000. He was one of the wealthiest men in England. He was a member of Parliament, representing Sunderland. He entertained aristocrats at his mansion in London. He was received by Prince Albert. He seemed untouchable. But Hudson's success was built on shaky foundations. He paid dividends from capital rather than from actual profits. When a company did not earn enough money to pay the dividends he had promised, he simply paid them out of the funds that investors had contributed for construction. This kept investors happy and kept share prices high, but it was not sustainable. It was, in modern terms, a Ponzi scheme. Hudson also manipulated share prices using inside information. He bought and sold shares in his own companies, profiting from knowledge that other investors did not have. He sold land to his railway companies at inflated prices, with himself on both sides of the transaction. He paid bribes to members of Parliament to secure approval for his railway bills. When the Railway Mania collapsed and share prices fell, Hudson's frauds were exposed. Investigators discovered the manipulated accounts, the payments from capital, the self-dealing transactions. Hudson was forced to resign from all his directorships. He lost his seat in Parliament. His wax figure at Madame Tussauds was melted down. George Hudson Street in York was renamed Railway Street, though it would regain its original name more than a century later. Hudson spent time in a debtor's prison. He lived his remaining years in obscurity, moving between lodgings, avoiding his creditors. He died in 1871, largely forgotten, a cautionary tale about the dangers of speculation and fraud. But the Railway Mania also left something behind, something more lasting than the losses and the scandals. The thousands of miles of track that were built during those frenzied years formed the backbone of Britain's railway network. Many of the routes that seemed foolish at the time turned out to be useful when they were eventually completed by larger, better managed companies. The mania was wasteful and destructive, but it also built something real. Let me tell you something quieter now, something to help you drift a little deeper into rest. Before the railways, every town in Britain kept its own local time. Time was determined by the sun, and the sun does not shine on every place at the same moment. When it is noon in London, the sun has not yet reached its highest point in Bristol, which is to the west. Bristol's noon comes about 10 minutes later than London's. Plymouth's noon is about 20 minutes behind London's. If you traveled by stagecoach, this did not matter much. The journeys were slow enough that a few minutes here or there made no difference. You would arrive when you arrived, and you would adjust your watch to local time. But the railways changed everything. Trains ran on schedules. They needed to arrive and depart at specific times, and those times needed to be the same for everyone along the line. A train leaving London at noon could not somehow arrive in Bristol at 11:50 in the morning, according to Bristol's clocks. That would be confusing. That would be dangerous. The Great Western Railway was the first to adopt a standardized time across its network. In November of 1840, they instructed all their stations to set their clocks to the time at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, which was already known as Greenwich Mean Time. This meant that a clock in Bristol would show the same time as a clock in London, even though the sun said otherwise. Other railways followed, one by one. The Midland Railway adopted London time at all its stations on the 1st of January, 1846. The Railway Clearing House, an organization that coordinated operations between different railway companies, recommended that Greenwich Mean Time be adopted at all stations as soon as possible. By December 1847, almost all railways in Britain were using railway time, as it came to be called. It was a strange thing at first. Some towns resisted. They kept two clocks, one showing local time and one showing railway time. The great clock on Tom Tower at Christ Church, Oxford, had 2 minute hands for a while, one for each system. People grumbled about London imposing its time on the rest of the country, but gradually the advantages became clear. Schedules were simpler, connections were easier. Accidents caused by confusion over departure times became less common. People got used to the new system. In 1880, Parliament passed the Statutes Definition of Time Act, making Greenwich Mean Time the legal standard throughout Great Britain. The railways had unified not just transportation, but time itself. Every clock in the country would show the same time, regardless of where the sun might be in the sky. This seems ordinary to us now. We are so used to standardized time that we cannot imagine a world without it. But it was the railways that made it necessary, and the railways that made it possible. The iron tracks and the steam engines changed not just how we travel, but how we think about time itself. Queen Victoria herself first traveled by train on the 13th of June, 1842. She rode on the Great Western Railway from Slough to London Paddington, a distance of about 18 miles. The journey took approximately 25 minutes. The locomotive was driven by Daniel Gooch, the company's superintendent of locomotive engines. He was only 25 years old, but he was one of the most skilled engineers of his generation. Isambard Kingdom Brunel himself rode on the engine to ensure that everything went smoothly. They could not afford any mistakes with the Queen aboard. The royal carriage was specially prepared for the occasion. It was 12 feet long, divided into 3 compartments, and decorated with hangings of crimson silk. There were sofas upholstered in velvet and footstools covered in silk. It was as luxurious as any carriage that had ever run on rails. Prince Albert had traveled by rail before, but this was Victoria's first journey. She was curious, but a little apprehensive. The whole idea of rushing through the countryside at such speeds was still novel and slightly alarming, even for a queen. Afterward, Victoria wrote in her journal that the journey had been delightful and so quick. She found it less tiring than traveling by carriage over rough roads. The smooth motion of the rails was gentler than the jolting of wheels over cobblestones. But the Queen also had strong opinions about how fast her trains should travel. She preferred to go slowly, and she made her preferences known to the railway companies. Her trains were instructed never to exceed certain speeds, usually around 40 miles per hour. She wanted comfort and safety, not speed records. The royal family became regular railway travelers. Victoria used the railways to travel between her various residences, from London to Windsor to Scotland. The railways built special trains for her, equipped with bedrooms and sitting rooms and all the comforts of a mobile palace. She spent countless hours aboard trains during her long reign, watching the countryside pass by the windows, resting in the rhythm of the wheels. If the Queen approved of railways, then surely everyone could. Her example helped to make train travel respectable for all classes of society. What had once seemed dangerous and uncertain now seemed modern and convenient. The age of steam had arrived. I have been talking for a while now, and perhaps you have drifted away. Perhaps you are already somewhere else, somewhere soft and warm and safe. If you are still with me, that is fine too. We are in number hurry. The train is still moving through the night. The wheels are still turning. The engine, somewhere ahead of us, is still breathing steam and smoke into the darkness. But here in our compartment, everything is quiet. I want to tell you a few more things before we part. Just small things, gentle things, facts and stories that might drift through your mind as you fall asleep. The gauge of a railway track, the distance between the rails, has a fascinating history. George Stephenson built his railways to a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. This was based on the coal wagonways he had known in his youth, which in turn were based on the width of carts and wagons going back centuries. Some people say the gauge can be traced all the way back to the ruts worn in Roman roads, though this is probably more legend than fact. Brunel, when he built the Great Western Railway, chose a different gauge. He believed that a wider track would allow for larger, faster, more stable trains. His gauge was 7 feet and a quarter inch, almost twice as wide as Stephenson's. He called it the broad gauge. For years, the two systems coexisted, but where broad gauge tracks met standard gauge tracks, everything had to be transferred. Passengers had to change trains. Freight had to be unloaded and reloaded. It was inefficient and frustrating. In 1845, Parliament appointed a commission to study the problem. The Gauge Commission took evidence from engineers on both sides. Stephenson's supporters argued that his gauge was already in widespread use and that changing it would be impossibly expensive. Brunel's supporters argued that the broad gauge was technically superior and worth the investment. In the end, Parliament sided with Stephenson. The Gauge Act of 1846 established his gauge as the national standard. Any new railways would have to be built to 4 feet 8.5 inches. The broad gauge was allowed to continue where it already existed, but it would not be permitted to spread. The last broad gauge trains ran on the 20th of May, 1892. Over one weekend, more than 100 miles of track were converted to standard gauge. An army of workers descended on the line, pulling up the old rails and laying new ones at the narrower width. By Monday morning, standard gauge trains were running where broad gauge had been. An era had ended. And so the gauge that George Stephenson chose, based on the coal wagons of his youth, became the standard for most of the world's railways. In America, in Europe, in Australia, in India, trains run on tracks that are 4 feet 8.5 inches apart. That distance, that seemingly arbitrary measurement, connects railways across continents and generations. It is one of the most enduring legacies of the railway age. The Thomas Cook Travel Company, famous for package tours and holidays, has its origins in the railway age as well. On the 5th of July, 1841, a cabinet maker and Baptist preacher named Thomas Cook organized his first railway excursion. He arranged for a train to carry about 500 temperance campaigners from Leicester to a rally in Loughborough, a distance of about 11 miles. The fare was 1 shilling per person, round trip. Cook was involved in the temperance movement, which campaigned against alcohol. He believed that railways could be used to promote moral improvement by carrying working people away from pubs and into the countryside for healthy recreation. His first excursion was a success, and he organized more in the following years. By the 1850s, Cook was arranging excursions to Scotland, to the seaside, even to the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. He claimed to have arranged transportation for more than 165,000 people to visit the exhibition. He pioneered the idea of the package tour, where travelers paid a single price that covered transportation, accommodation, and meals. In 1872, Thomas Cook organized the first around-the-world tour, a journey of 222 days covering 46,000 miles. The modern tourism industry can trace its origins back to that single railway excursion in 1841, 500 people paying a shilling to ride from Leicester to Loughborough and back. These are the small facts that I love about the railways, the connections between things that seem unrelated, the way that iron tracks and steam engines changed not just how we travel, but how we think about the world. The train we are riding tonight is part of that long tradition. The compartment we are resting in, the rhythm of the wheels beneath us, the darkness passing by outside the window. All of this connects us to the travelers who came before, the businessmen rushing between Liverpool and Manchester in 1830, the families taking excursions to the seaside in 1850, the Queen herself, riding in her velvet-upholstered carriage, watching the English countryside slide past. We are all part of the same story. We are all passengers on the same journey. The night is deep now. The train is moving steadily through the darkness. We have traveled far tonight, through time and memory and the gentle stories of those who came before us. But for now, there is only rest. Only the soft sway of the carriage, the warmth of the blankets, the knowledge that the train will carry us safely to wherever we need to go. The wheels are still turning beneath us, click and clack, click and clack. A patient rhythm, an unhurried sound. A sound that has carried millions of people safely through the night, generation toward sleep. Good night. Rest well. The train will carry you safely through the darkness. All is well. All is well. But before you drift away completely, let me share just a few more thoughts, a few more gentle images, a few more quiet moments from the railway age. Think about the stations, the great railway stations that the Victorians built. They were cathedrals of the new age, monuments to progress and commerce and human ingenuity. Some of them still stand today, serving passengers just as they did 150 years ago. Paddington Station in London was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, with help from the architect Matthew Digby Wyatt. It opened in 1854, and its great iron and glass roof spans still arch over the platforms. The roof is supported by cast iron columns decorated with wrought iron ornamentation. When it was built, it was one of the most impressive structures in London. Trains have been arriving and departing beneath that roof for more than a century and a half. King's Cross Station, also in London, opened in 1852. It was designed by Louis Cubitt in a simpler, more functional style. Its most distinctive feature was its two great arched train sheds, each spanning about 100 feet. The station served the Great Northern Railway, carrying passengers north toward York and Edinburgh and beyond. Harry Potter caught the Hogwarts Express from platform 9 3/4 here, though that is perhaps a different kind of story. St. Pancras Station, next door to King's Cross, was even more spectacular. It opened in 1868 with the longest single-span roof in the world at that time, arching over the platforms in a great curve of iron and glass. The station hotel, designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott, was a masterpiece of Victorian Gothic architecture, all red brick and pointed arches and towers reaching toward the sky. It fell into disuse in the 20th century, but has since been magnificently restored. Liverpool Lime Street, Manchester Victoria, Bristol Temple Meads, Edinburgh Waverley, Glasgow Central. All of these great stations were built during the railway age. They were places where the public encountered the power and grandeur of the railways. Places where travelers arrived from distant cities. Places where families said goodbye and hello. Places full of smoke and steam and the echoing sounds of voices and footsteps and the hissing of locomotives. The stations had their own ecosystems. There were porters to carry luggage, refreshment rooms selling tea and sandwiches, newsstands selling papers and penny dreadfuls, waiting rooms with coal fires burning in winter, first-class waiting rooms, separate and more comfortable, second-class and third-class facilities, progressively less fancy. The stations were small cities with their own rhythms and routines, and the platforms themselves, the places where passengers waited for their trains, where they watched the engines arrive, great iron beasts breathing smoke and steam, where they felt the platform vibrate as the locomotives passed, where they smelled the coal smoke and the hot oil and the peculiar, unmistakable scent of a railway station. These are the places that the Victorians built. These are the places that still serve us today. When you next walk through a great railway station, look up at the roof. Look at the columns and the ironwork. Think about the thousands of people who passed through before you. Think about the hands that built it, the minds that designed it, the dreams that made it possible. The railways changed how people lived, how they worked, how they thought about distance and time and possibility. Before the railways, most people never traveled more than a few miles from the place where they were born. They lived their entire lives in a single village or town. They knew everyone around them. They rarely encountered strangers. The wider world was something they heard about in stories, not something they ever expected to see. The railways changed that. A working person could now travel to a different city to look for work. A family could take an excursion to the seaside. A young couple could visit relatives in a distant town. The world opened up. The horizons expanded. The railways also made possible new kinds of communities. Before the railways, you had to live near where you worked. The factories and mills were surrounded by housing for their workers. Rich and poor lived close together in the same neighborhoods. But the railways made it possible to live in one place and work in another. A clerk could live in a suburb with trees and gardens and fresh air, and commute by train to his office in the city. The middle class began to spread out into new residential areas, connected to the city centers by railway lines. This was the beginning of suburban life as we know it today. The railways changed what people ate. Before the railways, food had to come from nearby. Milk would spoil before it could travel far. Vegetables would wilt. Meat would rot. Cities were dependent on whatever could be grown in their immediate surroundings. But the railways could move food quickly and cheaply. Milk from farms in the countryside could arrive fresh in London in a few hours. Fish caught at the coast could be eaten inland the same day. Fruits and vegetables from the fertile south could reach markets in the industrial north. The diet of ordinary people improved. The cities could grow larger because they could be fed. The railways changed how news traveled. Before the railways, news moved slowly. It could take days for word of an important event to spread across the country. By the time people heard about something, it was already old news. The railways carried newspapers as well as passengers. A paper printed in London in the morning could be on sale in Manchester by afternoon. News traveled at the speed of steam. People in different parts of the country began to share the same information, the same awareness of events, the same sense of being part of a larger nation. The railways even changed how people thought about death. Before the railways, funerals were local affairs. When a person died, they were buried in the churchyard of their parish, near where they had lived. But the railways made it possible to transport bodies over long distances. Special funeral trains carried the dead from cities to cemeteries in the countryside. The London Necropolis Railway, established in 1854, carried the deceased from Waterloo Station to the vast Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey, more than 20 miles away. These changes happened slowly, over decades. No one planned them all in advance. They emerged from the simple fact that people and goods could now move faster and cheaper than ever before. Each small change led to others. The cumulative effect was a transformation of how people lived. This is what the railways did. This is why they matter. Not just as a technology, but as a force that reshaped society itself. The people who built the railways were mostly ordinary men. Laborers, they were called, or navvies, a word derived from navigators, the men who had dug the canals a generation earlier. They came from Ireland and Scotland and Wales and the poorest parts of England. They went where the work was. The navvies lived in temporary camps along the route of the railway being built. They worked with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, moving earth by hand. The work was backbreaking. The hours were long. The conditions were dangerous. Accidents were common. Many died. But the navvies were also a community. They had their own customs and traditions, their own slang and songs, their own sense of pride in the massive works they were building. They moved from project to project, following the railways as they spread across the country. Some spent their entire working lives as railway navvies. When a section of railway was complete, the navvies moved on. But they left behind them something permanent. The cuttings and embankments they had dug, the bridges and viaducts they had built, the tunnels they had carved through solid rock. These things still carry trains today. Every time a train passes, it is a tribute to the navvies who built the line. There is something peaceful about thinking of these men, about their hard work and their simple lives, about the way they shaped the landscape without ever knowing what the world would become. They could not have imagined high-speed trains or electric locomotives or the digital timetables we use today. They just did their work, one shovelful of earth at a time, and when they were done, they moved on to the next job. The noise of their labor is long silent now. The camps where they lived are gone, but the railways they built are still here, still carrying passengers through the night, still connecting cities and towns, still part of the fabric of our world. Let this be the last thought that carries you into sleep, the thought of those men long ago, building something that would last, building something that would outlive them by generations, building something that would carry millions of people, including you, safely through the darkness. The train is still moving, the wheels are still turning, the night is still deep and quiet all around us, and somewhere in the distance, the first gray light of dawn is beginning to touch the horizon. But you do not need to see it. You do not need to wake. Train will continue without you noticing. The engineer will guide the locomotive through the last miles of the journey. The conductor will check the schedule and prepare for the arrival. All you need to do is rest. All you need to do is let the rhythm of the wheels carry you. All you need to do is sleep. The railways will still be here when you wake. The stations will still be standing. The tracks will still stretch from city to city, from coast to coast, from past to future. Nothing has been lost. Nothing needs your attention. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep well. And may your dreams be filled with distant journeys and peaceful arrivals. May you wake refreshed and ready for whatever the day may bring. May you carry with you, somewhere deep in your memory, the gentle rhythm of a train moving through the night. Thank you for traveling with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these old stories. Thank you for letting me share this quiet time with you. Until we meet again, good night. The signal boxes that controlled the railways deserve a moment of our attention as well. These small buildings, positioned at intervals along the track, were the nerve centers of the railway system. Inside each one, a signalman worked his levers, controlling the signals and points that directed trains along their proper routes. The job of a signalman was one of tremendous responsibility. A mistake, a moment of inattention, could cause a collision. Trains carrying hundreds of passengers depended on the signalman's vigilance. The work required constant alertness, especially at busy junctions where multiple trains might pass in quick succession. The signal boxes had their own atmosphere. The smell of oil and coal fire, the click and clatter of the lever frame, the bells that rang to announce approaching trains, each signal box communicating with its neighbors in a code of rings that indicated train movements. The block system, as it was called, ensured that only one train could occupy a section of track at a time. Signalmen worked in shifts around the clock. They saw every train that passed, day and night, rain and shine. They knew the rhythms of the railway intimately. They knew which trains were usually on time and which were usually late. They knew the faces of the regular drivers and firemen. They were part of a vast human network that kept the railways running safely. Most of the old signal boxes are gone now, replaced by electronic systems and centralized control rooms. But a few survive, preserved as museums or still in occasional use on heritage railways. They are reminders of a time when the railways depended on human skill and attention, when every safe journey was the result of countless small decisions made correctly. The sounds of the railway at night were distinctive. The distant whistle of an approaching locomotive, the rumble of wheels on rails, the hiss of steam being released, the ringing of the signal bells, the clunk of points being changed. These sounds carried through the darkness, marking the passage of trains, reminding people in their beds that the world was still moving, that life was continuing even while they slept. There is something deeply comforting about these sounds. They speak of order and purpose, of reliable schedules and safe operations, of a system that functions smoothly night after night, carrying people and goods to their destinations. The sounds of the railway are the sounds of civilization at work. Even now, in our modern world, the sounds of trains at night have a special quality. They speak to something deep in our collective memory. They remind us of journeys taken and journeys yet to come. They lull us toward sleep with their steady, rhythmic promise that all is well. The train we are riding makes these sounds, the wheels on the rails, the gentle creak of the carriage, the occasional whistle as we approach a crossing. These are the sounds that have accompanied travelers for nearly 200 years. These are the sounds that will carry you into sleep. Listen to them now. Let them fill your awareness. Let them push away any lingering thoughts or worries. There is nothing in these sounds but peace. Nothing but the steady, reliable progress of a train through the night. The fireman on the locomotive ahead of us is stoking the fire, adding coal to keep the steam pressure high, watching the gauges, making sure the engine has the power it needs to pull us through the darkness. He has done this 1,000 times before. He will do it 1,000 times again. This is his work, and he does it well. The driver beside him is watching the track ahead, watching for signals, watching for any obstruction. His hand is on the regulator, controlling the speed of the train. He knows this route intimately. He knows every curve and grade and signal. He knows where to go fast and where to slow down. He will bring us safely to our destination. These men are part of a long tradition, the drivers and firemen of the railway age. The men who spent their lives on the footplate, in the heat and noise of the locomotive, watching the track unwind before them, mile after mile. They were proud of their work. They took satisfaction in running their trains on time, in handling their engines skillfully, in carrying their passengers safely. Some of the most famous drivers became celebrities in their own right. Engine drivers were heroes to children who watched the trains pass. Boys dreamed of growing up to drive locomotives, to stand on the footplate and control those massive machines. There was a romance to the work, a sense of adventure and importance. But there was also hardship. The work was physically demanding. The hours were long. Drivers and firemen were exposed to the elements, to rain and wind and cold. They breathed coal smoke constantly. Many developed respiratory problems. Many died young. Still, they kept coming, generation after generation of young men who wanted to work on the railways, who wanted to be part of something larger than themselves, who wanted to feel the power of a locomotive beneath their feet and watch the world pass by through the windscreen. Think of them now as you drift toward sleep. Think of the driver and fireman on our train, somewhere ahead of us in the darkness. Think of their concentration and skill. Think of how they are carrying us safely through the night, just as their predecessors have carried travelers for nearly 2 centuries. You are in good hands. You are on a well-maintained track. You are being guided by experienced professionals. There is nothing to worry about. There is nothing to do but rest. The track stretches ahead of us, iron rails gleaming faintly in the starlight. The signals are clear. The points are set. The way is open. We will arrive at our destination in the morning, refreshed and rested, ready for whatever awaits us. But that is for later. That is for another time. Right now, there is only this moment, this carriage, this gentle motion, this peaceful darkness. The Victorians who built these railways could not have imagined the world we live in today. They could not have dreamed of aircraft or automobiles or the internet, but they would recognize this feeling of being carried through the night on iron rails, this feeling of trusting the machine and the people who operate it, this feeling of surrendering to the journey and letting sleep come. It is a very old feeling now, almost 200 years old, but it has not changed. It has not lost its power. It still works, just as it did on the first railway trains that ran through the English night. Let it work for you now. Let the rhythm of the wheels do what they have always done. Let them rock you gently like a cradle. Let them carry you away from wakefulness, away from worry, away from everything but the peaceful darkness of sleep. The train moves on. The night grows deeper. The stars wheel slowly overhead, and you, wrapped in your blankets, warm and safe, drift further and further into rest. There is nothing more to say. There is nothing more to do. The story is told. The journey continues, and you are exactly where you need to be. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep well. And know that you are not alone. Know that millions of travelers before you have fallen asleep to this same rhythm. Know that millions more will follow. You are part of a great chain of sleepers, stretching back through time, all of them carried safely through the darkness by the railways. This is the gift that the Victorians gave us. Not just a way to travel, but a way to rest, a way to let go, a way to trust the machine and the track and the people who tend them, and to drift away into peaceful sleep. Accept the gift. Let it carry you. Let the train do its work. Good night. Good night. Good night. If you are still awake, still listening, that is perfectly fine. Some nights it takes longer to drift off than others. Some nights the mind needs more time to settle. Let me tell you a few more things then. A few more gentle stories to carry you the rest of the way. The coal that powered the locomotives came from deep beneath the earth. Think about that for a moment. The energy that moved the trains, the heat that boiled the water, the steam that drove the pistons, all of it came from coal that had been forming in the ground for millions of years. Ancient forests, compressed over eons, transformed into black stone that could be burned. The miners who dug that coal worked in darkness, hundreds of feet underground. They crawled through narrow passages. They breathed dusty air. They faced the constant danger of cave-ins and explosions and flooding. Their lives were hard and often short. And yet, without them, none of the rest would have been possible. No locomotives, no railways, no journeys through the night. Think of them kindly, those miners. Think of the coal that dug, now being shoveled into the firebox of our locomotive, feeding the flames that keep us moving. There is a connection between us and those men in the darkness below, even if we never think about it. Their labor, transformed into heat, transformed into steam, transformed into motion, is what carries us safely through the night. The water that becomes the steam also has a journey. It is drawn from rivers and wells and reservoirs. It is pumped into the tender of the locomotive. It flows into the boiler, where the heat of the fire transforms it into steam. The steam expands, pushing the pistons, turning the wheels. Then it exhausts into the night air, disappearing into the darkness, returning to the atmosphere from which it came. There is something poetic about this cycle: water to steam, to motion, to air. The same water molecules that were once in rivers and clouds and oceans, now carrying passengers through the night. The natural world, harnessed to human purposes, yet still following its own ancient rhythms. The Victorians understood this connection between nature and industry. They spoke of the power of steam with something like religious awe. Steam was the force that would transform the world. Steam would abolish distance and time. Steam would make the impossible possible. And they were right in their way. Steam did transform the world. It connected cities and continents. It moved people and goods at speeds that seemed miraculous. It created new industries and new ways of living. The world we inhabit today is, in many ways, the world that steam built. But the Victorians also worried about what they were creating. They worried that the machines would make life faster and more stressful. They worried that the countryside would be ruined by smoke and rails. They worried that traditional ways of life would be swept away. Some of those worries proved justified. Some of them did not. The world changed, as it always does, and people adapted. The railways became normal. The speed became ordinary. What had once seemed terrifying became comforting. The sound of a train in the night became a sign that all was well with the world. And here we are, nearly 2 centuries later, still riding trains, still finding comfort in the rhythm of the wheels, still falling asleep to the sound of motion and machinery. Some things, it seems, do not change. The bridges that the Victorian engineers built to carry their railways were marvels of the age. Iron and steel, spanning rivers and valleys that had once seemed impassable. Each bridge was a problem solved, an obstacle overcome, a testament to human ingenuity. The Britannia Bridge, designed by Robert Stephenson, carried the Chester and Holyhead Railway across the Menai Strait in Wales. It used wrought iron rectangular tubes, large enough to carry trains inside them. The tubes were lifted into position using hydraulic jacks, an operation that required precise coordination and nerves of steel. The bridge opened in 1850 and served for more than a century before a fire damaged it and it had to be rebuilt. The Royal Albert Bridge, designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, carried the Cornwall Railway across the River Tamar at Saltash. It used a unique combination of arched trusses and suspension chains, creating a structure that was both strong and elegant. Brunel was too ill to attend the opening ceremony in 1859. He was carried across the bridge on a specially prepared flat car a few weeks later, just months before his death. The bridge still carries trains today. The Forth Bridge in Scotland, completed in 1890, was one of the greatest engineering achievements of the Victorian era. Its cantilevered spans stretched more than a mile across the Firth of Forth. It used more than 50,000 tons of steel. When it opened, it was the longest single cantilever bridge span in the world. It is still in use today, carrying trains between Edinburgh and the north. These bridges were built to last. They were built by people who believed in permanence, in quality, in doing things right. They were built by engineers who understood that what they were creating would outlive them by generations. And so it has proved. The bridges still stand. The trains still cross them. The work endures. Think of those bridges as you drift towards sleep. Think of the rivers flowing beneath them, just as they have always flowed. Think of the trains passing overhead, just as they have passed for more than a century. Think of the continuity of it all. The past connected to the present connected to the future. All of it linked by iron and steel and stone. The sleeper carriages that we are riding in evolved over many decades. At first, overnight train travel meant simply sitting up in a regular carriage, trying to sleep as best you could. It was uncomfortable and exhausting. Travelers arrived at their destinations tired and sore. Then, the railway companies began to experiment with sleeping accommodations. The Pullman Company in America developed luxurious sleeping cars in the 1860s, and the idea spread to Britain. Beds that folded down from the walls, private compartments with doors that locked, blankets and pillows provided by the railway, attendants to make up the beds and wake passengers before their stops. The sleeping car made long-distance travel by rail truly comfortable. A passenger could board a train in London in the evening, have dinner in the restaurant car, retire to their sleeping compartment, and wake the next morning in Scotland or Cornwall or wherever they were going. The journey that would once have required days of travel could now be accomplished while sleeping. We take this for granted now. We expect comfort when we travel. We expect to arrive rested and ready. But someone had to invent this. Someone had to imagine it, design it, build it, prove that it could work. The sleeper carriage is a gift from those who came before us, a solution to a problem we never had to solve ourselves. And here we are, in our compartment, in our bunks, warm and comfortable, traveling through the night. The lamp is dim, the blankets are soft. The rhythm of the wheels is steady and unchanging. This is what all those years of development and innovation have given us. This moment of peace. This opportunity for rest. Accept it gratefully. Let yourself sink into the comfort. Let the gentle motion rock you towards sleep. This is what the sleeping car was made for. This is its purpose. This is why it exists. The night outside is very dark now. If you were to look out the window, you would see only vague shapes passing by. The silhouettes of trees, the distant lights of a village, the occasional flash of a signal, but mostly darkness. The great darkness of the countryside at night, unbroken by electric lights, peaceful and deep. In the Victorian era, this darkness was even more complete. There were no highways lit by street lamps, no towns glowing with neon signs. When the sun went down, the darkness was absolute. The trains moved through it like ships through an ocean, small islands of light and warmth in a vast sea of black. The passengers on those early night trains looked out at that darkness and saw mystery. They saw the unknown. They saw all the things that might be out there, just beyond the reach of the carriage lights. It was thrilling and a little frightening. The world seemed larger then and stranger. But the darkness also brought peace, away from the bustle of the cities, away from the noise and crowds and constant activity. In the darkness, there was only the train and the track and the endless miles rolling by. There was solitude. There was quiet. There was the opportunity to think, or to not think, as the mood took you. We have lost some of that darkness in our modern world. Our nights are brighter than they used to be. There are fewer places where the stars shine clearly, where the blackness is complete. But on a night train, you can still find it. You can still experience the world as our ancestors did, rolling through the darkness, carried by steam and iron, rocked by the rhythm of the wheels. Let the darkness comfort you now. Let it wrap around you like a blanket. There is nothing in the darkness that can hurt you. There is nothing out there but the quiet countryside, sleeping peacefully, waiting for the dawn. You are safe. You are protected. The train is strong, and the tracks are sound, and the people who run this railway know what they are doing. You can let go. You can stop watching. You can close your eyes and let the darkness inside your eyelids match the darkness outside the window. Sleep is coming. You can feel it approaching, a heaviness in your limbs, a softness in your thoughts, the edges of awareness growing fuzzy and indistinct. This is how it should be. This is what the night train offers. This is the gift of rhythm and motion and darkness. Let it take you. Let it carry you. Let it bring you to the peaceful place where dreams are born. The train will continue without you. The wheels will keep turning. The engineer will keep watching the track. The fireman will keep stoking the fire. Everything will proceed as it should, and you will sleep. You will sleep deeply. You will sleep well. And when the morning comes, when the first light touches the horizon, when the train begins to slow for its final approach, you will wake refreshed. You will wake ready. You will wake grateful for this journey, this night, this rest. But that is for later. That is for another time. Now there is only sleep. Now there is only the rhythm. Now there is only peace. Good night, traveler. Safe journey. Pleasant dreams. The world of the Victorian railways was a world of constant sound. The hiss and puff of locomotives, the clatter of wheels, the squeal of brakes, the whistle blowing at crossings, the slam of carriage doors, the shouts of porters and guards, the rumble of freight trains passing in the night. These sounds formed a kind of music, a symphony of industry and motion. People who lived near railway lines grew so accustomed to it that they hardly noticed anymore. It became part of the background of their lives, part of the rhythm of their days. But travelers heard it differently. For them, the sounds were still new, still exciting, still a little miraculous. The sound of a locomotive whistle could quicken the heart. The sound of wheels on rails could stir the imagination. The sounds meant adventure. They meant possibility. They meant the world was opening up. Listen to the sounds of our train now. The steady rhythm of the wheels, the occasional creak of the carriage, the faint sounds of the engine somewhere ahead. These are the same sounds that passengers have heard for nearly 200 years. They connect us to all those who have traveled before. The sounds will continue through the night. They will be there when you fall asleep. They will be there when you dream. They will be there when you wake. They are the constant companions of the night train traveler. Let them lull you. Let them soothe you. Let them carry you away. The trackside cottages that housed railway workers were often simple structures, small brick buildings with slate roofs positioned at intervals along the line. Signalmen lived in them, track maintenance workers, gatekeepers who operated the level crossings. These cottages were isolated, miles from the nearest village sometimes. The workers and their families lived surrounded by the railway, by the constant passage of trains, by the rhythms of the timetable. Their children grew up knowing every locomotive by sight. Their wives learned to cook around the schedule, putting dinner on the table between train passages. It was a strange life, but not an unhappy one. There was security in railway work, steady wages, a roof over your head, a sense of purpose and belonging. The railway families took pride in their work, in keeping the line safe and smooth, in playing their small part in the great enterprise. Those cottages are mostly gone now. The ones that remain have been converted to other uses. But once they dotted the landscape, small signs of human presence in the vast network of iron and steam. Small homes where families lived and loved and grew old, all while the trains passed by outside, day and night, season after season. Think of them kindly, those railway families. Think of the children falling asleep to the sound of passing trains. Think of the mothers and fathers going about their work, connected to something larger than themselves. They were the human heart of the railway, the people who made the machines run. And in a way, they are still with us. Their descendants work on the railways today. Their traditions have been passed down. The culture of the railway, the pride and the professionalism, the dedication to keeping the trains running safely, all of that continues. We are all part of that tradition when we ride the train. We are all beneficiaries of all those years of careful work. We are all connected to all those people who came before, who built and maintained and operated the railways that we now take for granted. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep well. The train continues on its journey. The night grows later. The dawn is still hours away. There is nothing to do but rest. The compartment is warm. The blankets are soft. The rhythm is steady and unchanging. All is well. All is safe. All is exactly as it should be. Good night. May your sleep be deep and dreamless. May you wake refreshed and at peace. May the gentle rhythm of the train carry you safely through the darkness until the light returns. Good night.